Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm really appreciate that you took the time out of your busy days to join us tonight. I'm really excited about this special session, the first time that we've done something like this. But whether this is the first time you've joined us at one of our meetings or if you've been with us for a while, I want you to know how much we really appreciate you being here. The participation and everybody being involved is really what's going to make this, I think, one of those impactful sessions that we'll have. So, one of the things that I've learned in working with caregivers is that, we're all really good at taking care of everyone else around us, and we're not always that good at taking care of ourselves. So, I just want to make sure everybody understands that, tonight it's about you. And it's about understanding why certain moments seem to hit us so hard, why a phone call or a hospital hallway or waiting for lab results can suddenly bring back these overwhelming emotions. And most importantly, tonight is about learning practical ways to try to respond to those moments. Not because we're trying to stop caring. I want to make sure everybody understands that, but because we want the fear and the anxiety that goes along with that to kind of stop controlling our lives. So, I'd like to start with one simple thought. Many caregivers believe that healing means that they'll eventually stop feeling so anxious or stop worrying or stop being afraid. But, I don't really think that that's the goal here. The goal isn't to stop caring. At the end of the day, caring is what brought each of us here. That's why we're here. The goal is really to learn how to carry those difficult emotions without allowing them to carry us. So, to start out, I kind of love the reminder that's on this slide. You are not trying to feel nothing. You are learning to carry hard feelings without letting them run the day. It's That's the only
The
thing that
only thing
you
that
get
you
from
get
tonight,
from
the
tonight.
only thing you remember. I hope you do keep that in mind. So let's dig right in. I want to start with the survey insights. We had 42 people respond to the survey. I really appreciate that. And these first three slides are just going to kind of give us a baseline to get started. So the first question was, how long have you been a caregiver? And as you can see here on the screen, the majority that responded were more than 10 years out in caregiving. The second largest group was 1 to 3 years, and the third largest was 4 to 7. So 47.6 were in that 1 to 7 year time frame. And again, 31% were greater than 10 years. So I think what this tells me is that the need for caregiver support is there all during the stages of the transplant journey, whether you're pre-transplant, whether you're in that very first year where things are a little bit tough and very intense, or whether you're further down the road. And I think the fact that more than 10 years came up as the top individual answer just indicates that the need for caregiver support is there. And that was, I thought, very insightful. The second question was simply what type of transplant caregiver you are. And you can see that of those that answered in our group, it was primarily heart transplant with kidney and lung close behind. Those don't necessarily mirror the national numbers in terms of transplants. The largest number of transplants are kidney, but that just is a representation of what we saw based on the responses that were given. Now, this I think is the most important survey result that we saw. This question asked, have you ever experienced symptoms that you believe may be related to caregiver PTSD or post-traumatic stress? And as you can see, 47.6%, nearly half, required or responded frequently, that they feel those things frequently, and another 38.1% occasionally. So between those two, you've got 85.7% of respondents who felt frequently or occasionally that they experience these symptoms. So that's really validation for what this is all about tonight. That's why when this came up as a topic and we decided to go ahead and move forward with a night like this, that's really why. So clearly, caregiver PTSD is something that we commonly face in this community. So that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the evening. So here are the survey insights. And again, we're going to go into these individually, so you don't have to study the graph here, but I just wanted you to be able to see the visual. Everything that we're going to discuss tonight came directly from the caregivers. So this isn't theory, and these aren't statistics that were collected from people who, have never sat in the hospital waiting room like we have. These are really from caregivers, people who know exactly what it feels like to wonder what's going to happen next. So our survey showed us some very important things. Caregivers experience many of the same emotional triggers. So if you've ever wondered, am I the only one that feels this way? The answer is resounding, absolutely not. And as we review the survey, several themes appear over and over again: fear, waiting, exhaustion, isolation, anxiety, hypervigilance. Now, none of these really surprise me because caregiving asks us to live with uncertainty every single day. But I think the encouraging part is that the caregivers also shared what actually helps. And that's what tonight is all about. Not just identifying these triggers, but learning ways to respond to them. So let's dig in. So, the very first one, fear of rejection. It's one of the most common responses that we heard overall involved fear. Fear that the treatment that you're on won't work, fear of hearing bad news, fear of what tomorrow might bring, that proverbial other shoe. So many caregivers admitted something that I think we've all probably done. When we have these issues, we start searching online and looking for answers. We're trying to prepare ourselves for what's about to come. But the problem is, most of those internet searches don't really reduce anxiety. And frankly, they usually increase it. So instead of trying to ask yourself, instead of that, try to ask yourself, what do I really know today? Not what am I afraid might happen tomorrow? That's where the grounding can become helpful. So concentrating on what you can control today and focusing on the facts instead of the future possibilities is a really good way to sort of handle this trigger of fear of rejection. Another technique that we'll talk about several times in several slides is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique. So I'm going to introduce that here. Just take a moment and we'll try to kind of do this together. So we'll kind of go through this slowly, and then you'll see this reappear several times during the presentation. So it's really quite simple. It's a grounding technique that tries to bring your mind back to ground zero. So basically, you look around the room and you start trying to name 5 things that you can see. Pretty easy. 5 things that you can see in the room. Then you think about 4 things that you can actually touch in the room. And then 3 things that you can hear. And sometimes it's something subtle like the ticking of a clock. 2 things that you can smell. And you might have to use your imagination unless you're in the kitchen for this one, but 1 thing that you can taste. Now, it sounds simple, but what it does is it reminds our brains, look, I'm here, I'm in this moment, and I'm safe. And so, even though it may sound silly to you, taking the time to practice that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, using your senses and grounding yourself is really a good technique to chase away some of the things that we feel, the fear and sometimes the anxiety. So, another one that came up very strongly, waiting for labs results, biopsies, or test results. I think if I asked everyone here what's one of the hardest parts of caregiving, I would suspect that many of you would probably say waiting. Seems like we're constantly waiting for the results from a scan or from a biopsy. We're waiting for lab work or we're waiting for the phone to ring, whether we're waiting for that call about the organ or we're waiting to hear back from the team on some question that we had. And sometimes waiting is really harder than receiving the actual answer because while we're waiting, our imaginations kind of fill in the blanks and we begin preparing ourselves for the worst case scenario before we really even have the facts. So one strategy that caregivers shared was, staying busy while they waited, going for a walk, meeting with a friend, reading a book, watching a movie, something that reminds your mind that life is still happening today. So it's important to remind yourself of the facts and not just focus on the fears. And if you can, as hard as it is sometimes, you need to avoid repeatedly checking, patient portals or emails. Try to schedule some activities when you know you're going to be waiting, something that will keep you occupied. And try to limit that what if thinking. And if you can, reach out to another caregiver who has gone through this and sort of understands those anxieties. Hospitals also become emotional places for us. Even sometimes walking through the doors can cause our heart rate to increase. Our breathing changes and old memories start to return. And, it's completely understandable because our brain looks at a hospital and it remembers places where difficult experiences have happened. And one thing that can help is remembering that today's appointment is not the same as yesterday's crisis. So every visit is different and every day is different. A couple of things that came up as suggestions: bringing someone with you, not going there by yourself, arriving early, taking a few minutes and a few deep breaths before you walk inside. So don't put yourself under the gun, get there early. And it's those kind of small things that, can really make the difference. And then, when hospital memories return, which sometimes they do, even after everything is over, a memory comes rushing back. So maybe it's the sound of a monitor, or walking down a particular hallway, or the smell of hand sanitizer, or a date on the calendar. Now, those memories don't mean you're going backwards. They simply remind us that something important happened here. And instead of fighting those memories, we need to acknowledge them. We need to say to ourselves, it was hard, but that's not what's happening right now. They're two very different things. And when those memories feel overwhelming, it's so important to talk to someone. And again, that's why support communities like TCH Caregivers Heart exist, because healing happens faster when we don't have to carry those memories alone. And before clinic appointments, prepare the questions that you have in advance so that you're not worrying about that or stumbling over those. Have a plan when you go in. I think it's important, this came up, to bring notebook or a journal to capture those answers, because sometimes in the clinic setting, things go very quickly and there's a lot going on, and it's easy to forget what the answers to the questions that you had really are. If you can, take a minute and practice some deep breathing before you enter the clinic. Give yourself the time, if you can do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, to get your mind right. And, focus on gathering the information rather than anticipating the bad news. Sometimes we go into those clinic visits sort of anticipating bad news. And then, this came up as a suggestion and I'd never really thought of it, but I like it. Reward yourself with something enjoyable afterwards, whether that's a coffee or an ice cream or whatever it is, but have a plan to reward yourself afterwards to kind of take away a little bit of the sting of that hospital clinic visit. So far tonight, we've talked about situations that often trigger PTSD, things like hospital visits, waiting, medical appointments. So now I want to take a moment to shift our focus more inward. I want to talk a little bit about some of the emotional triggers that caregivers identified in the survey as the most difficult to deal with. Those are things like, exhaustion and anxiety and thoughts racing and isolation. And we'll take a practical look at ways to respond to these with compassion for the others and for ourselves. So we've talked about the situations that can trigger caregiver PTSD. Again, hospital visits, waiting for test results, clinic appointments. But sometimes the hardest triggers aren't those things that are outside, they're things that are internal, things inside of us. They're emotional responses that quietly build up over weeks and sometimes months, and as the survey indicated, sometimes years of caregiving. So our survey asked caregivers what emotional struggles affected them the most. And the answers were consistent. They look and let's take a look at what was shared. The number one response wasn't fear, it wasn't anxiety, it was emotional exhaustion. More than 80% of caregivers said this was one of their biggest struggles, 83.3% to be exact. And again, honestly, that doesn't really surprise me. We know that caregiving isn't just physically demanding, it's emotionally kind of relentless. You're constantly making decisions, you're watching for changes, you're managing appointments. You're supporting someone you love while trying to hold yourself together eventually weakens your emotional battery and it starts running low. So, something I'd like to say tonight to the caregivers, and it's an old saying, but we have to be always cognizant of it. You can't pour from an empty cup. So taking a break doesn't mean that your loved one or your family member is less important. Accepting help doesn't mean that you failed. It actually means you're making sure that you have enough strength to continue the journey. So sometimes the most loving thing you can do is caring for the caregiver. And we always have to remember that we're the caregivers. So taking those intentional breaks, allowing yourself time to recharge, and prioritizing self care with whether it's exercise or healthy eating or hobbies. And then accepting help from others, something that's sometimes difficult for us to do, but we need to recognize how important that is and do that. And again, as always, connecting with supportive people who understand the journey. Now, the second highest response was actually anxiety. And anxiety has a way of kind of convincing us that every possibility is a probability. And it whispers to us, what if something's wrong? What if the treatment doesn't work? What if tomorrow changes everything? But here's what I've observed, and I think what I've learned. Our minds are very creative, and often they're too creative. This is really true. So take a listen. Most of the things we spend time worrying about never really actually happen. So when anxiety begins writing tomorrow's story for us, it's important to pause, take a slow, deep breath, and ask yourself, what do I know to be true today? Bring yourself back to today's facts, not the fears of tomorrow. So again, practicing that deep breathing or that mindfulness exercise, taking that walk or whatever other physical activity. And again, focusing on facts instead of worst case scenarios, always helpful when anxiety is part of the picture. I want to ask you this. Have you ever climbed into bed at night, completely exhausted physically, only to have your brain decide that this is the perfect time to replay every conversation, every appointment, every possibility you thought of through the day? If you are, you're not alone. Caregivers often describe this as feeling like they just simply can't turn their minds off or their thoughts are racing. So, one strategy I really like that came up is writing those thoughts down. And that's not because you're solving them, but because you're telling yourself, you know what, I won't forget this and I can come back to it tomorrow. Another helpful idea is scheduling what therapists often call worry time. So, this is hard to do, but if you can train yourself, instead of worrying all day long, set aside 15 or 20 minutes every day and spend that time worrying. And then later on in the day when those thoughts come back, gently remind yourself, you know, I've already given that my attention today. I'm not going to think about it any longer. And kind of it's amazing how much control that little simple habit can create. So don't forget about writing your worries down in a journal or notebook and setting aside that worry time and using that grounding technique. Those are all ways to help us calm those racing thoughts. And redirecting our attention to a specific task or activity is also a great way to kind of calm those racing thoughts. This slide, you know, of all of them might really be the most important, and this insight might really be the most important. 61.9% responded with this, but PTSD and anxiety and depression and all these things we're talking about, they really thrive in isolation. So, you know, caregivers often tell themselves that nobody understands and sometimes that they don't want to burden anyone else with these things and that they should be able to handle this on their own. But I think here's what happens. The more isolated we become, the louder those fears become. And when you think about it, that's exactly why communities like TCH Caregivers Heart exist, because we can't solve everyone's problems. That's not the goal, but we can remind each other that you're not walking this road alone. You know, sometimes hope begins simply by hearing another caregiver say, you know what, I've felt that way too. So, attending caregiver support whenever you can, I think, is important. Participating in a community or a faith based or a volunteer activity is also another way not to feel isolated and to maintain that contact with the outside world and with your community. I think it's important to schedule regular check ins with family or friends. Family and friends can be a great source of comfort. They can sometimes be a source of frustration, I know, but scheduling those regular check-ins, I think, is a really important thing. And this is really key. Remember that asking for help is truly a sign of strength, and it's not a sign of weakness. So sleep is also one of the first things that caregiving sometimes steals from us. Even when we're physically tired, our minds stay on duty, like we talked about. Always vigilant, always listening, always waiting, always watching. Caregivers tell us all the time that they check patient portals or emails or lab results right before going to bed. And I understand that. They're hoping for reassurance, but more often than not, they find more questions than they do answers. So I think it's important to try to create a bedtime routine that tells your brain, look, the caregiving day is finished. Read something encouraging, pray, meditate, listen to calming music. Just give yourself permission to rest. The world can wait for tomorrow. So establishing that consistent routine, practicing those relaxation, limiting screen time, and kind of avoid checking the labs and the emails and patient portals at night might help you, get better sleep. And then there's hypervigilance. It's a word that sometimes sounds complicated, but many caregivers know exactly what this feels like. You're constantly scanning, you're watching, listening, preparing yourself for the next emergency. Even when nothing is happening, your body stays alert and ready. And that's exhausting in and of itself. So sometime you can interrupt that cycle just by asking yourself a question. Is there a problem that's happening right now? Or am I preparing for something that hasn't even happened yet? That simple question, I believe, helps many caregivers separate today's realities from the possibilities of tomorrow. So asking that question and limiting excessive symptom checking and constant vigilance and trying to establish daily routines that create some sort of steadiness and giving yourself permission to step away from caregiving. That's a really important one. And it's one I think we don't do often enough is allow ourselves real breaks and giving ourselves the grace and the permission to step away, whether it's for a moment or for a half a day or for a day. But stepping away is really important. And then there's this one that comes up almost all the time. And this one is sometimes difficult to talk about, and caregivers often don't talk about it. And that's resentment. Now, resentment is not because you don't love the person you're caring for, and it's not directed toward the person you're caring for, but it's because caregiving does change everything in your life. Your plans change, your dreams can change. It causes careers to be paused and relationships to shift, sometimes with family and friends. And, sometimes caregivers feel guilty for even admitting that they're frustrated or that they're feeling that resentment. But let me tell you something having those feelings doesn't make you a bad caregiver, it makes you human. The most important thing isn't pretending that resentment doesn't exist, it's recognizing it, talking about it, and making sure it doesn't quietly grow into bitterness. That's another reason support groups matter. We create safe places for honest conversations. So, acknowledging your feelings without guilt or judgment, communication and communicating those needs and asking for support, taking those regular breaks and prioritizing yourself, and focusing what is actually within your control. And this is one we don't do often enough. Celebrate those small victories, the things that, you know, give us joy. It's important to recognize those and to celebrate those when they happen. Okay, so we spent most of the time tonight talking about the challenges and the triggers and the anxiety and the exhaustion, but I think the survey also asked some really important questions. It asked what actually helps. And the answers we got weren't complicated. They weren't, an expensive thing to go out and find. They weren't really medical in nature. They really were centered about people. Caregivers consistently said that one of the greatest sources of healing was connecting with other caregivers who truly understand what they were going through. Now, that tells me something very important. Sometimes the best medicine isn't advice, Sometimes it's simply being understood. So let's look at why support communities make such a difference. First and foremost, I think they remind us that we're not alone. I can't tell you how many times someone has joined one of our groups and believing when they joined that they were the only person who felt overwhelmed, that they were the only person who cried in the parking lot that day or after an appointment, that they were the only one who questioned whether they were doing enough. And then they hear some other caregiver tell them almost the exact same story. And, there's something incredibly healing about that. Support groups become places where practical wisdom is shared, not from textbooks, but from real world experience. So, one caregiver might share a coping strategy that completely changes someone else's week. And I really think that's the power of community. So, doing things by joining the community and sharing with other caregivers helps reduce feelings of isolation that we talked about. It reminds caregivers that it reminds caregivers that others truly understand the challenges and fears and the emotions of the caregiver journey. It provides a safe place to share those experiences without fear of judgment, and it gives caregivers a place to express the concerns that they might not feel comfortable discussing elsewhere. It offers practical advice, coping strategies from people who have faced similar situations. It creates a sense of hope and resilience by hearing those success stories and celebrating milestones. And it validates emotions and experiences that help caregivers realize that the feeling of stress, the fear, the exhaustion, and the frustration are not both common and understandable. Support for communities also help by building meaningful relationships long term and supporting networks that caregivers can lean on during those challenging times. They encourage self care and emotional well being by providing regular opportunities to focus on caregiver needs, not just the needs of their loved ones. And they remind caregivers that they're not alone, which is often one of the most powerful antidotes to PTSD, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion. If you remember one thing, one message from tonight, I hope that it's that connection is the most powerful coping strategy we have. Isolation convinces us that we're carrying something no one else could understand. Connection reminds us that we're carrying it together. And that's why TCH Caregiver Heart exists, not because we can remove every challenge, but because we can make sure that no caregiver has to face those challenges alone. And sometimes that can change everything. So here are some everyday habits for managing general anxiety. Healing doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens through small choices, repeated over time. Taking a walk, sitting outside for 10 minutes, spending time in prayer, reading a book, calling a friend, working in your garden, doing something that reminds you that you are still you. You're not just a caregiver. You're still a person with dreams and interests, talents, and a life that deserves attention too. Now, those small habits become like anchors and they steady us when life feels unpredictable. And then there's long term resilience. It's not something that we're born with, it's something we build one choice at a time, one conversation at a time, one difficult day at a time. Some days, resilience looks as simple as getting out of bed for the day. Some days, it looks like asking for help. Some days, it looks like saying, you know what? I'm just not okay today. And it's okay to not be okay. So resilience isn't pretending everything is fine. It's continuing to move forward even when life is hard. You need to be patient with yourself. You need to give yourself grace because healing is rarely in a straight line. So I'd like to take us back to where we started tonight. Remember what I said. The goal isn't to stop caring. The goal is learning to carry difficult emotions without letting those emotions carry us. And I think that's worth repeating because caregivers often believe that they've become stronger by becoming harder. But that's not really true. You don't have to stop feeling. You simply need healthier ways to carry those feelings. And that's really what we've been talking about all night. So I'd like to share a few words from some of the caregivers who participated in our survey. And once again, thank you all so much for being such an important part of this. As you listen to these, notice something. Every quote is a little different, but everyone carries the same overall message. Take care of yourself. Stay present. Accept help. Don't try to carry everything by yourself. Sometimes the people walking the journey right beside us can become our greatest teachers. So here's a few that I picked out of the many that we received, and I really like these. So focus on the here and now. The best advice my therapist gave me was not to future trip. Don't worry about the things that you think could happen in the future. Focus on the now. Always good advice. Sometimes you must let go of being in control. Everything cannot rest on your shoulders. You must take care of yourself to be able to care for others. I think that's also a very important point. And you have to take time for you. I didn't, this person said, and I'm still paying the price. It's okay to step away, even if your loved one doesn't really want you to. A couple of others. Make sure to take time for yourself, be it a spa day, sleeping all day. I like that one. Shopping. Just do something that you love to do, at least a few hours, no less than once a month. Stay busy with hobbies like gardening or reading or prayer walks or getting out with friends. It helps keep your mind from racing and worrying. And this is a good one to close with. Know it's okay to feel these things. We are going through it alongside of the patient. I know I'm not the one that had the surgery, but I've been there through it all. And that really is true. So I'd love to hear from you now. So remember, in this conversation, there are no right answers. There are no wrong answers. There's just honest conversation. Let's talk about these things, and we'll go into each one of these in detail. What triggers affect you most? What has helped you? What didn't help? What would you tell someone who has just begun the caregiving journey? So I'm going to stop the recording here because I want to make sure that we maintain privacy as we go through and have these very open and frank conversations. I'm also going to take the screen sharing down so that we can see each other. But I've got all these questions right here, and I'll pose those questions. And what I'll do is invite everybody to please respond, jump in, share your thoughts, share thoughts on what other people say. This is kind of the part of the discussion tonight that will be just like one of our regular sessions. A topic comes up and we all weigh in. And that's where the real power is in that community. So give me a second. I'm going to stop the recording.